Greetings, students. Today we're going to kick off our online course entitled Studying Made Simpler with a quick look at memory, a user's guide. Well, obviously memory equals learning. We can't say that we haven't really learned anything that we can't remember and use when we need it. As the musician B.B. King said, the beautiful thing about learning is that no one can take it away from you. So how is it that we can take something that seems so fleeting and so momentary and turn it into something permanent? How do we hold on to what we learn in memory? Well, very simply stated and flowed on this chart, it's a process. Our five senses are constantly inundated with data and impressions from our environment. And the flow of information, and once it's entered our brain through our senses, it passes through something called our sensory memory, which lasts only a few seconds, and then it's on to working memory, if our brain has deemed it valuable enough, where it's held for seconds to a few more minutes, and there we decide, we work with it and decide what to do with it after that, really based on how meaningful the information turns out to be. And anything that feels meaningful and that we work with very deliberately will go on into long-term memory. It can last for weeks, years, months, and possibly for a lifetime. And then ultimately, that's the information that's available for retrieval when we need it for anything. For anything you can imagine in life or on tests, projects, anything that you want to use to make meaning of your world, in school or not. So let's take a look at how this happens, again, very briefly. And memory is incredibly complex. And the fact is that there are many areas of your brain working all the time, anytime information's entering your brain and being stored into memory in one form or another. In fact, in his book Brain Rules, John Medina writes how it's important to remember how incredibly important memory is. In fact, quote, researchers agree its broad influence on our brains is what makes us consciously aware. We don't go to sleep and then, upon awakening, have to spend a week relearning the entire world, unquote. So our memory is something that ties us to our past and our present and our future. So sensory memory, again, is very fleeting. It lasts only a few seconds. And you can imagine if it didn't do that, we would be so paralyzed with information and overloaded and unable to act or do anything meaningful, which makes sense from an evolutionary point of view. We couldn't be so bogged down with information that we couldn't react to something that might be a threat or something incredibly interesting in our environment. So this information, if we don't work with it, if it seems just like nothing very important, it simply fades away. Anything that seems a little more important goes on to working memory. Working memory we can sort of imagine as being our mental desktop. This is where we're actively manipulating information in one form or another. Pretty deliberately. This is a pretty conscious thing. We've decided to pay attention and to see what we can figure out. Our working memory has a very small holding capacity. In fact, only 5 to 7 bits of information, like a phone number, not coincidentally, are about the capacity of our working memory. So if you hold on to that phone number, mentally that is, and you rehearse it and you play with it, you'll probably be able to remember it and make the phone call you need to make. You might not remember it, though, in a few hours or a few days. And if you don't mess with it mentally at all, it will simply be gone. So the next step, if you pay attention and you have elaborated on this information by playing with it, it will move on to long-term memory. That's the storage system, the vault that holds memories that are very, very important, but deemed with great importance by the brain. And there they can be held for days, weeks, months, years, and possibly a lifetime. So let's see what can we take away from what we've talked about so far. In order to remember anything, really, you have to understand it. You have to be able to make sense of it. And you have to connect it to what you already know. This is something that happens fairly automatically, or your teacher might ask you to make connections very explicitly to what you already know. And this is not just a figurative way of looking at how we learn. Here's a picture of a neuron that's connected to lots of other neurons, and you have billions of them. And the fact is that as you build knowledge, you're actually building neurons in your brain. And the things that you use and remember most often, like your multiplication tables, for example, might become a very strong and streamlined pathway that receives special attention and gets faster and faster the more automatic your memory becomes. So as you learn, your brain is physically changing. And the last thing you do to help remember anything is make it personal. The things that you remember without even trying are those things that are very important and personally meaningful to you. For example, if my social studies teacher is trying to teach me the word tribute in relation to some forgotten civilization, I might look up in the dictionary at dictionary.com. Here I have 5 possible definitions, and I like number 3 because it's pretty short, and it says a rent, tax, or the like as that paid by a subject to a sovereign. Okay, well, I might remember that, and all I'm seeing is some text, and then again I start to remember, well, I've heard this word before. And then I can put it in a context that's meaningful to me. I've made a connection to something that I'm very familiar with, which is the book and the movie, The Hunger Games. So now I have a visual representation to go with the word of Katniss giving herself up as tribute in place of her sister. So I've made this personally meaningful, and I am very sure I'm going to remember this word in a new context, that of social studies. So what happens to most of what is quote-unquote learned in school? Well, back in 1913, a man named Ebbinghaus did a study on the rates of his subjects forgetting meaningless syllables. So these statistics nicely illustrate the need for strategies to improve short-term and long-term retention of information. You can see from the chart that after 20 minutes, you've forgotten about 50% of what you just learned. And a month later, well, you've forgotten almost 80% of it. So what are the implications for school when it's so important that we constantly build on what we've learned and that we can retain and retrieve information that we need for tests and to just keep learning? Well, this shows us how important it is to review, and in essence, that is what studying means. So how do we counteract this insidious reality? Well, here's a chart that shows that with that line sweeping toward the bottom, that with no review, we're going to forget. In a month, it's almost gone. With regular review, you can see the line at the top. We can keep bringing it back. Bring the information back and back up to the 100% mark. But what it takes is repeated review. So as the course goes along, we'll be looking at study strategies that can do this very thing for us. And I think you'll be surprised to see that this doesn't have to be difficult or very time-consuming. What's really important is that we actually put effort into it and that we do have fairly regular review. Much more effective over the long term than cramming for exams. So I hope that you've learned here briefly today the importance of study strategies. And here are some references. And as our course goes along, we will be looking, as I said, at specific strategies to enhance the stages of memory. So I hope you enjoyed this, and we've got a lot more ahead. Thanks!